This is one of the most famous cases in Europe in the 20th century. The case of Caroline Dickinson, a 13-year-old girl found dead in a room of a youth hostel in France, where 4 other teenagers were also sleeping. The investigation that led to the arrest of her killer, an international serial rapist, is truly remarkable because it demonstrated the persistence of the French police, the effectiveness of international cooperation, and also marked the beginning of extensive DNA testing in criminal investigations. Late in the morning of July 18, 1996, John Dickinson was at his workplace in Cornwall, in the southwest of England, when his boss approached him. The boss asked John to step into his office, saying there was something he needed to tell him. Inside the office, police officers were already waiting, an introduction that almost never brings good news. The officers informed John that they had come regarding Caroline. His 13-year-old daughter was dead, and she had died under mysterious circumstances. Caroline Dickinson was an ordinary girl who loved being at home. She took ballet lessons, played the clarinet, and was a member of the school orchestra. Her parents, Mother Sue, who worked as a nurse, and Father John, an environmental specialist employed by the local council, were divorced. However, Caroline had a good relationship with both of them and spent a lot of time with them and her younger sister Jenny. That summer, Caroline was on a trip to France with a group of other teenagers from Britain. She was learning French, and visiting France had been a dream of hers. She had saved up most of the money needed for the trip herself and asked her father to cover the rest. Although Sue was not very keen on letting her go, John agreed to pay for the trip. Caroline was having a wonderful time in France, as she wrote in the postcard she sent to her family. July 17th was the last day of the trip, and on July 18th, the group was scheduled to head back home. On their last day in France, the teenagers visited the famous local attraction, Mont Saint-Michel-Abbé, and afterward, they were accommodated in a youth hostel in Plaine-Fougère, Brittany. Besides Caroline, there were 4 other teenagers sleeping in room number 4. By breakfast time, everyone had woken up, except Caroline. Her friends thought she was pretending and tried to shake her awake, but then noticed that her skin was cold and her lips had turned blue. They called for a nurse who quickly realized that nothing could be done to help Caroline. Between her legs, she saw a bloodstain. Naturally, the police were immediately called to the crime scene. Caroline's parents, John and Sue, were devastated. It was the first time their daughter had gone on a trip without them, as if she were an adult. Her vacation was nearing its end, and she was supposed to return home any day. But now she was dead. The girl's parents immediately traveled to Brittany. Meanwhile, a forensic pathologist was working at the crime scene. Caroline had likely died from suffocation, but the autopsy report was needed for a definitive determination. Since the girl's pajama bottoms were lowered and there was blood in the genital area and on the mattress, he suspected that she had been assaulted. There was also a semen stain found nearby. Today, this would be a significant breakthrough for the investigation, but in 1996, DNA analysis was still in its infancy. There were no databases of criminals, especially those who had committed sexual offenses. Nonetheless, the perpetrator's DNA could help convict the killer if a suspect was found. Apart from this, there were no other clues. The girl's mattress had not been moved, but under the sheets lay a piece of cotton wool measuring 9 centimeters by 12 centimeters. Investigators speculated that it might have fallen from one of the girl's bags. A group of 40 teenagers had come from Britain on this trip. They were questioned one by one, starting with the boys. Then the teachers, drivers, and anyone who could have approached the girls' room were interviewed, including 6 tourists who had stayed at the hostel the previous night. Particular attention was paid to the 4 teenagers who were in room number 4 with Caroline. There were 2 bunk beds in the room, but there were 5 teenagers, so Caroline slept on a mattress on the floor, laid between the 2 beds. The teenagers explained that Caroline had asked for this arrangement because they were friends and she wanted to spend the night together with everyone. One of the girls said the last thing she remembered was them all gazing at the beauty of the night sky, while Caroline sang a lullaby called Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. After that, they all fell asleep. But how was it possible that none of them heard anything? The room was very small. In fact, 2 of them did hear something during the night. One girl said she heard Caroline kicking the mattress. Then she heard moans, a raspy cough, and thought she heard Caroline say, "Mom, Mom, help!" The girl assumed her friend was having a nightmare. Another student saw a shadow in the doorway, but assumed it was one of the other girls going to the bathroom. It never occurred to them that something serious was happening, so they fell back asleep. However, it wasn't just the British students staying at the hostel. There were other guests as well, including 2 pairs of bikers. One couple reported that someone peeked into their room at night, as if they had mistaken the door. but the biker's wife stayed awake and heard the man walking down the corridor, opening other doors. Generally, there was a lot of movement in the hostel, even in the evening, as people went to take showers and then dispersed to their rooms. Naturally, this raises the question, why wasn't the girls' room locked? It was strictly forbidden to lock the doors for safety reasons, such as in case of a fire. However, in such a crowded place, someone surely must have seen something. Around midnight, 3 girls who went to the bathroom together saw a man with unkempt hair. Apparently, the same man was seen on the 2nd floor by teacher Nicholas Ward at 12:15 a.m. Very interesting testimony came from a witness in room 5 named Amy. The girl explained that her eye was itching badly because the boys had smeared shaving cream on her face, so she wanted to go to the bathroom to wash up. But when she was in the corridor, she thought she saw the head mistress, so she quietly returned to the door and froze in fear upon seeing a large unknown man. His hand was on the doorknob of the neighboring room. The girl was so scared that she silently closed the door and waited for 15 minutes before heading to the bathroom. When she finally went out, she saw the same man again, but this time he was going down the stairs. He noticed her, made a grimace, and said something, though she didn't understand what. It might have been in Spanish, but Amy wasn't sure. One of the teachers, named Jackie, also saw a large man with disheveled hair. Around 5 in the morning, she heard footsteps and thought it was one of the kids trying to sneak out. So she looked out the window into the courtyard. She saw a man wearing a jacket and jeans, who turned left and disappeared from sight. Shortly afterwards, she heard the sound of a car starting. Judging by the noise, it was an old vehicle. Thus, the suspicious stranger was seen by many, and people even noticed him, but they couldn't call the police just because the man looked suspicious. The autopsy results arrived, confirming that Caroline had been strangled. The cotton pad found under the sheets had traces of her saliva and blood, indicating that the killer had used it to suffocate her. The girl had also been sexually assaulted. The forensic expert concluded that the assailant acted with a finger or some object while simultaneously satisfying himself, which explains why semen was found on the mattress and her pajama pants. Additionally, the expert noted that Caroline's bladder was empty. Since it takes the body 15 to 45 minutes to start refilling the bladder after urination, he concluded that she had visited the bathroom shortly before her death. The police investigation, led by an examining magistrate, initially kept all details of the case secret. Suddenly, a press conference was held to announce a major breakthrough. 2 days after Caroline's murder, the police had arrested a suspect named Patrice Pade, a 39-year-old vagrant who was known for alcohol and drug abuse. Most importantly, he had a prior conviction for a sexual offense and matched the description provided by witnesses. When shown his photo, several witnesses identified Patrice as the large man seen at the hostel. Upon his arrest, Patrice initially denied any involvement. However, after 43 hours, he confessed to the assault and murder of Caroline. Though his statements contained significant inaccuracies, such as describing Caroline as a blonde and incorrectly recalling the sleeping arrangements of her roommates. Nevertheless, the confession was considered a significant victory, and the case seemed to be closed just 4 days after the crime. As a precaution, a DNA sample was taken from Patrice and sent to the laboratory. Once in custody, he immediately began writing letters to the judge, insisting that his confession had been coerced and that he was innocent. He claimed that he had been deprived of his medications and alcohol, which was critical for him as an alcoholic. The judge ignored his letters. For over a week, the media celebrated the success of the case, but then the DNA test results arrived. While DNA can confirm guilt, it can also exonerate the innocent. It turned out that Patrice's DNA did not match the semen found on Caroline's pajamas. Multiple tests were conducted, and the results remained consistent. Patrice was not the killer. This development became a notorious example cited by defense lawyers to criticize the police's reliance on confessions, which do not constitute absolute proof. The judge, however, was reluctant to relinquish his perceived success. Although he had to release Patrice, he placed him under surveillance, suspecting him of being an accomplice to the actual perpetrator. Yet the notion that 2 men could enter the small room without being heard or noticed by any of the teenagers seemed far-fetched. The setback was a significant blow to both the investigators and Caroline's parents. At least Patrice was compensated for the 17 days he spent in prison, receiving 10,000 euros in 1998. The investigation returned to square one, but the police were unable to make any significant progress. Meanwhile, on July 25th, Caroline was buried, and on the day of her funeral, her parents received a postcard from her, which she had sent from France. For John and Sue, this was simply unbearable. John was especially distressed by the lack of results and the investigating judge's refusal to share any information with them. After 8 months, John decided to return to Brittany to push the investigation forward. He requested that the investigating judge compare the DNA of all the men in the village of Plenfugar with that of the killer, every last one of them. The judge was shocked by this request, considering it a crazy endeavor that would cost a fortune. He wanted nothing to do with it and demanded that John's lawyer, Dickinson, explain how investigations were conducted in France rather than trying to pressure him into it. This sparked a confrontation between the judge and the father. After another 3 months, John Dickinson secured support from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He wrote to President Chirac asking for the investigating judge to be replaced, accusing him of inaction. No one had questioned the residents living near the hostel. Crucial witness testimonies had been ignored, and no fingerprints had been collected. And now the judge was also unwilling to respond to the father's request for a thorough examination of the men in the village. John's determination was palpable. The investigation was handed over to a new judge, Renaud van Rooyenbeeke, who was open to such extensive measures. He agreed with John's belief that the killer lived in the village of Plenfugar, or a neighboring village. He was even afraid to consider that the perpetrator might have come from another region, let alone another country, as finding him would be like searching for a needle in a haystack, virtually impossible. Thus, it was decided to check all men in the region aged 15 to 35. This was the first such extensive DNA testing in France. Many local men were willing to participate, although they were concerned that the results could be erroneous. Ultimately, 400 men from the village were tested, followed by 3,500 men from the surrounding region. However, all the tests came back negative. Furthermore, the new judge van Rooyenbeeke decided to take an action that his predecessor had completely ignored. He published a composite sketch of the suspect in the press. A few months after the murder, a teacher accompanying a group of children staying in Plenfugar confided in the college director where he taught, admitting that he had encountered someone in the hostel corridor that fateful night, but had not told anyone. Investigators returned to England to interrogate him, and he broke down in tears. He couldn't forgive himself for not coming forward earlier, and found it difficult to look the other students in the eye. It turned out that he had some drawing skills. He created a composite sketch of the suspicious stranger. The sketch depicted a man of European descent, athletic build with broad shoulders, tousled hair, thick eyebrows, and pronounced facial features, around 30 years old. The composite was published in newspapers across France and Britain. The Sun newspaper even offered a reward for information about the man. This led to fantastic results, generating over 3,000 leads that needed to be investigated one by one. However, the police discovered that around the same time Caroline was killed, similar attacks had occurred in the region. For example, in Saint-Lunaire, 50 kilometers from Plenfugar, an incident took place on the same day as Caroline's death. 4 young English girls were staying in a hostel room there. One of them, Kate, recounted waking up to a man approaching her, placing his hand over her mouth, and preparing to remove her underwear when her roommates woke up. The girls turned on the light and saw a large man with disheveled hair. They asked him what he was doing in their room, to which the stranger calmly left without slamming the door. The girls reported the nighttime incident to their teachers and chaperones, but since they were scheduled to board a ferry the following day, they decided not to contact the police. It wasn't until articles about Caroline's case appeared in the British press that Kate revealed to her parents that something similar had happened to her. What was particularly interesting was that laboratory analysis confirmed Caroline had been strangled with a type of cotton wool that had been brought from Britain, but no such cotton was found in Plenfugar. It turned out that Kate's mother had given her that cotton wool. This indicated that the killer had taken the cotton from the site of his unsuccessful attack and used it to strangle Caroline. This established a connection between the two attacks. He had failed in one hostel and decided to complete his crime in another. But that was not all. Similar attacks occurred over the summer in other neighboring villages. The victims were often young English girls. Judge Renaud van Rooyenbeeke then decided to work with a profiler, a relatively new approach in France. This collaboration allowed him to gain a better understanding of the killer and assailant as someone who moves freely between hostels and targets young girls, sometimes older teenagers. After consulting with the profiler, van Rooyenbeeke and the investigators compiled a list of 223 individuals who matched this profile. Many had alibis, and ultimately the list was narrowed down to 95 individuals. Soon, van Rooyenbeeke proposed an idea that gave an incredible boost to the investigation. He requested the police to look into similar attack cases in youth hostels across all of France, not just in the region. Then they discovered a case dating back to 1994, 2 years before Caroline's murder. It occurred in La Turin, where a group of Irish girls was staying in a hostel. One of the girls awoke at night to find a man sitting on her bed. He asked if she wanted to get up and help him fix his car. Shocked, she repeatedly asked who he was, but he did not respond. The girl turned on the light, after which he got up and left. The most striking part of this incident was that she saw him the next day at a picnic. He passed by and smiled at her. She reported the encounter to the hostel director, and the man was apprehended by the police. He did not deny being in the room, but claimed he had simply made a mistake and entered the wrong room. No charges were filed against him because he essentially hadn't done anything wrong. Gendarmes decided to keep watch over the hostel, and on the night of July 19, 1994, around 2:30 a.m., they arrested a man who was trying to enter the building. When interrogated, he stated that he had done nothing wrong, that he lived in London, worked as a waiter, and was simply looking for a place to spend the night. His car was registered in the Netherlands. It was searched, but nothing was found. After 8 hours, he had to be released. However, they recorded his name, Francisco Archimontes. Francisco was a Spaniard, 47 years old at the time. His description largely matched the composite sketch of the suspect. Although he seemed to have no direct ties to the village of Plainfuger, he became a suspect due to his handwriting being similar to that of the killer. At the age of 20, Francisco first exhibited troubling behavior when he exposed himself to a neighbor. He was sent to a psychiatrist who diagnosed him with depression and progressing schizophrenia. Francisco occasionally worked as a waiter or driver, but mostly relied on financial support from his father. Surprisingly, his first assault led to a brief romance and the birth of his son. In 1981, he broke into the room of a French woman in a hostel in the Netherlands, where he sexually assaulted her without her consent. They later crossed paths in Paris, where they began a relationship and became parents. However, the woman soon left Francisco due to his aggressive behavior. In addition to this incident, he faced 4 charges of violence in Germany, 14 cases in Spain, and 1 more attempted assault in France prior to Caroline's murder. He had cards from various hostels worldwide because he always stayed in them while traveling. This painted a troubling picture for Judge Renaud van Rooyenbeek, who feared that Francisco might be an international serial offender. The pressing question became how to locate him, given that he did not stay in one place or even one country for long. The judge contacted the police in Spain and asked them to visit the man's mother's house in Asturias. However, the woman stated that she hadn't seen her son in a long time. During their last meeting, the son took the money that his father had left him as an inheritance and never returned. Judge Renaud van Rooyenbeek had achieved significant success in the investigation, but at that very moment, he was transferred to Paris, and his position was to be taken over by his colleague, Francis Doybin. On March 30, 2001, Francis Doybin gave an interview to the British newspaper, The Sunday Times. The judge mentioned that investigators had narrowed the list of suspects down to 40 people, with the name Francisco Archimontes at the top of the list. In France, it would have been impossible to publish the name of a suspect who had not been formally charged or even interrogated. However, since this was the British press, that issue did not arise, and the journalist boldly printed the name. Then fate intervened in the investigation. Several copies of the Sunday Times were sent to Detroit. Although Americans typically do not read British newspapers, Tommy Ontko, an employee of the U.S. Immigration Service, came across the newspaper and read the article about Caroline's case. He remembered reading about the case before and was surprised that it had not been solved yet. His professional curiosity prompted him to enter the name Francisco into the database, and he found it. Not only had Francisco crossed the U.S. border, but he had also been imprisoned in Miami for assaulting a girl from Ireland. He was awaiting trial. It turns out that Francisco, sticking to his habits, had stayed in a hostel in Miami. It was a very inexpensive place, mainly populated by tourists or students. Initially, he attempted to sneak into the room of 2 tourists from Chile while one girl was sunbathing by the pool and the other had returned to the room. When the second girl opened the door, she saw a man near her sleeping friend's bed. The stranger claimed he had the wrong room and quickly disappeared. The tourists were frightened but did not report it to the police. Meanwhile, 4 students from Ireland were also staying in the same hostel. They returned quite late at night and went to bed. In the morning, one girl discovered that a towel was lying on her intimate parts, but she distinctly remembered going to bed in a t-shirt and shorts after her shower. The girl reported that her underwear had been shifted, and she felt uncomfortable in her intimate area. Semen was found on the bed linens. Upon learning about the incident involving the students, the tourists from Chile also reported that a man had entered their room. The next day, the Chileans saw the man sneaking around them. He was casually walking by the pool. The girls contacted the police, and the man was taken to the station. It was only there that he finally agreed to give his name, Francisco Archimontes. During the interrogation, the man asked strange questions that confused the police. For example, he inquired whether it was considered a crime to enter someone else's room while drunk and whether masturbation was a crime. Thanks to the intervention of U.S. Immigration Officer Tommy Onco, things moved very quickly. The Americans took his DNA and compared it with the DNA of Caroline's killer, and it matched. Francisco Arce Montes had assaulted and murdered Caroline Dickinson in Brittany 5 years earlier. His criminal record was phenomenal. He had committed assaults all over the world, in Spain, Germany, England, Chile, Mexico, the U.S., and France. He was an international serial offender. Naturally, he refused to be extradited. He wanted to be tried in the U.S. first for the attempted assault. However, he was handed over to France. Francisco's trial took place in 2004. The prosecution gathered all the testimonies to understand what happened on that day. On July 15th, Francisco visited a hostel in the village of Plenfuguer to scout the area, although he was already well acquainted with the layout of rooms in hostels. On the 17th, around midnight, he returned intending to commit a crime. He was seen by teacher Nicholas Ward and 3 girls heading to the restroom. Since there were too many potential witnesses awake in the building, Francisco left the premises and drove 50 kilometers to another hostel in the village of San Lunar. However, he was met with failure there as he was spooked. He then decided to return to Plenfuguer, hoping that everyone was asleep since it was already nearing 4 a.m. There is a possibility that Francisco spotted Caroline when she returned from the restroom, or that he randomly entered room number 4. The man did not deny assaulting Caroline but claimed that he did not intend to strangle her. It was an unfortunate accident. He insisted that he was mentally ill and not responsible for his actions. Nevertheless, he was sentenced to the maximum penalty for his crime, 30 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. He appealed but lost. A few years later, in 2010, he requested to serve his sentence in Spain, but his request was denied. In 2015, he was also accused of assaulting a young woman that had occurred in 1997, a year after Caroline's murder. He was tried in Spain and sentenced to 11 years in prison. He must serve this sentence after his release from French prison, where he is to remain until January 2027. In 2018, he was sentenced to an additional 2 months in prison for assault. Clearly, Francisco Archimontes will not be released anytime soon. This case demonstrates how effective cooperation among several countries can be, even if they sometimes need a bit of luck. This brutal crime will be remembered thanks to the diligent work of investigators and the investigating judge, who were willing to undertake monumental and very difficult work, as well as the incredible chain of events that led to the arrest of the assailant and murderer. But above all, this was made possible thanks to the efforts of John Dickinson, Caroline's father, who never gave up and believed that one day the perpetrator would be caught.